The following scene contains sensitive images that may be disturbing to some viewers. Viewer discretion is advised. The Báthory family was not merely noble, but stood among the most powerful dynasties in all of Central Europe. Their lineage stretched back centuries, with their blood intertwined with the ruling houses of Poland, Transylvania, and Hungary itself. They had produced princes and cardinals, military commanders and political strategists, and their coat of arms featuring 3 wolf teeth was recognized and feared throughout the region. The family controlled vast estates in the northeastern reaches of the Kingdom of Hungary, lands that straddled the dangerous border between Christendom and the Ottoman Empire. This was frontier territory, where castles were built for survival rather than comfort, and where violence was woven into the fabric of daily existence. Into this world of privilege and brutality, Erzsébet Báthory was born on August 7, 1560, at the family estate of Nyírbátor. Her parents were both Báthorys, a marriage between branches of the same family designed to concentrate wealth and power. The young Erzsébet received an education remarkable for a woman of her era, learning Hungarian, Latin, and German, while being instructed in estate management and noble etiquette. She was by all accounts intelligent and willful, qualities that would serve her well in the years to come. But her childhood was also steeped in darkness. Public executions, judicial torture, and casual violence against peasants formed the backdrop of her youth. She witnessed punishments that would horrify modern observers, spectacles of suffering presented as entertainment and moral instruction. The Báthory family itself harbored members whose reputations spoke of cruelty and madness, though how much was truth and how much political slander remains impossible to determine. What is certain is that Erzsébet grew up in a world where nobles answered to virtually no one, and where the lives of common people held little value. At age 11, she was betrothed to Ferenc Nadasdy, son of another powerful Hungarian dynasty, sealing an alliance between 2 great families whose union would shape her destiny in ways no one could yet imagine. The Báthory dynasty represented one of the most formidable noble houses in all of Central Europe, their influence extending across Hungary, Transylvania, and even into the Polish crown. Their ancestral estates sprawled across the northeastern frontier of the Hungarian kingdom, a volatile borderland where Ottoman raids were a constant threat and where survival demanded both cunning and ruthlessness. The family had produced princes and cardinals, warriors and statesmen, their coat of arms with its 3 wolf teeth serving as a symbol of power that commanded respect and fear in equal measure. It was into this legacy of privilege and violence that Erzsébet entered the world on August 7, 1560. Her parents were both members of the Báthory clan, a union between different branches designed to consolidate the family wealth and influence. Such intermarriage was common practice among the Hungarian aristocracy, though later observers would speculate about what consequences this concentration of bloodlines might have carried. The young countess received an education extraordinary for any woman of the 16th century. She mastered Hungarian, Latin, and German, studied the management of noble estates, and learned the intricate protocols that governed aristocratic society. Contemporary accounts describe her as remarkably intelligent, possessed of a sharp mind, and an iron will that would define her throughout her life. Yet the world that shaped her was one of profound darkness. Public executions served as popular entertainment, judicial torture was an accepted instrument of the law, and violence against servants and peasants was simply the natural order of things. Stories persist of a young Erzsébet witnessing a gypsy sewn alive into the belly of a dying horse as punishment for his crimes. Whether this specific tale is true matters less than what it reveals about the environment that formed her character. The Báthory family itself harbored whispers of instability and cruelty among its members. While her uncle István would rise to become king of Poland, other relatives carried darker reputations. In this world of absolute aristocratic power, Erzsébet Báthory learned early that nobles operated beyond the moral constraints that bound common people. At 11 years old, Erzsébet Báthory was promised to Ferenc Nadasdy, heir to another of Hungary's great noble dynasties. This was no romantic union, but a calculated political alliance designed to merge the influence of two powerful families. The Nadasdy clan controlled extensive territories in western Hungary and boasted a proud tradition of military service against the Ottoman threat. Ferenc himself would grow into a legendary warrior, earning the epithet the Black Knight of Hungary for his brutal effectiveness on the battlefield. The betrothal followed the elaborate customs of aristocratic negotiation, with contracts specifying properties and obligations, while the young bride was sent to live with her future husband's family, as tradition demanded. The transition proved difficult for the strong-willed Erzsébet, and rumors would later circulate about scandals during these years, including whispers of a pregnancy by a peasant boy that was quietly concealed. Whether truth or slander, such stories suggest she had already earned a reputation for willfulness by the time of her wedding. The marriage ceremony took place on May 8, 1575, when Erzsébet was 15. Over 4,000 guests attended the celebrations at the Nadasdy seat of Szarvár, and the Holy Roman Emperor himself sent gifts acknowledging the union's significance. From the beginning, Ferenc's military duties kept him away for months or years at a time, leaving Erzsébet to manage the vast Nadasdy estates alone. Their primary residence became Čachtice Castle, a grim fortress, perched on a rocky outcrop that dominated the surrounding countryside. Within those walls, Erzsébet proved herself a capable administrator, handling complex affairs of business and politics with intelligence and efficiency. But servants also began to whisper about their mistress's temper, about punishments that exceeded even the harsh norms of the era. Maids who displeased her might be beaten, pricked with needles, or forced to stand naked in winter cold. Ferenc apparently raised no objections to these methods, and some sources claim he taught her torture techniques learned during his campaigns. Whatever the truth, the couple seemed united in their belief that those beneath them existed only to serve and suffer at their pleasure. While Erzsébet ruled the household, her husband Ferenc Nadasdy was carving his legend into the bloody borderlands of Ottoman Hungary. The Turkish Empire stood at the apex of its power during these decades, its armies having seized the great fortress of Buda in 1541 and brought much of central Hungary under the Sultan's dominion. The frontier regions existed in a state of perpetual warfare, with raids and counter-raids, sieges and skirmishes forming the brutal rhythm of daily existence. Ferenc thrived in this violent world. He combined personal bravery with tactical cunning, rising swiftly through military ranks until he commanded Hungarian forces during the long Turkish War that raged from 1593 to 1606. His methods earned him both victory and infamy. Captured Ottoman soldiers received no quarter, and Ferenc developed a reputation for creative cruelties designed to terrorize his enemies into submission. The title Black Knight spoke not only to his dark armor, but to his darker deeds. Later testimony would claim that during his visits home, he shared these techniques of torment with his wife, that the couple discussed methods of punishment and discipline with disturbing enthusiasm. The wars brought Ferenc wealth and glory, but kept him absent from Čachtice for years at a time. Erzsébet bore 5 children who survived infancy, and by all accounts proved an attentive mother. securing educations and arranging marriages appropriate to their station. Yet beneath this surface of domestic normalcy, servants whispered of gathering darkness. They spoke of a mistress whose temper grew increasingly volatile, whose punishments escalated beyond any pretense of discipline. A girl who failed to properly arrange her hair might find needles driven beneath her fingernails. A laundress who scorched fabric might be burned with heated irons. Whether these accounts represent truth or later fabrication remains impossible to determine with certainty. What is clear is that something was developing within those castle walls, something that would eventually demand the attention of powers far beyond the local peasantry who suffered in silence. On January 4, 1604, Ferenc Nadasdy succumbed to an infected battle wound at the age of 49. His death transformed Erzsébet Báthory into one of Hungary's wealthiest and most powerful widows, sole mistress of the vast Nadasdy estates, and answerable to no man. For a woman of her particular temperament, this unprecedented freedom would prove catastrophic. The years following Ferenc's death appear to mark a terrible acceleration in whatever darkness had been growing within Čachtice Castle. Young women who entered the Countess's service began disappearing with alarming regularity. The official explanations varied from illness to accidents to dismissal, but the numbers mounted, and the bodies that occasionally surfaced told grimmer tales. Erzsébet had gathered around her a circle of trusted accomplices. These included János Újvári, a dwarf known as Fixko, who served as major domo, Ilona Jo, an elderly woman who had been her childhood nurse, Dorothea Szentes called Dorka, and a younger servant named Katalin Benitka. All would later face accusations of participating in their mistress's crimes. The victims were predominantly young peasant women, lured to the castle with promises of respectable employment and good wages. What awaited them instead was nightmare. Later testimony would describe systematic horrors, including savage beatings, burning with hot irons, mutilation, and prolonged torture, ending in death. Estimates of victims ranged from dozens to over 600, though the higher figures almost certainly represent exaggeration. The most famous element of the Blood Countess legend holds that she bathed in the blood of virgins to preserve her youth and beauty. This image has dominated every subsequent retelling of her story. Yet this detail appears nowhere in contemporary trial records, emerging only in accounts written decades after her death. Most historians now dismiss it as Gothic embellishment. The truth, if the accusations held any validity at all, was likely more straightforward but no less horrifying. Here was a woman of virtually unlimited power and apparently sadistic disposition, operating in an environment where her victims had no protection and her actions faced no consequence. According to testimony gathered after her arrest, Čachtice Castle had become a place of methodical horror, where young women entered service never knowing if they would survive the week. The methods of torment described by witnesses were varied and inventive in their cruelty. Beatings formed the most common punishment, administered with clubs, whips, or bare hands until victims lost consciousness or died. Erzsébet reportedly participated with enthusiasm, continuing to strike her victims until exhaustion forced her to command servants to take over. Some girls endured daily beatings for weeks, their wounds never permitted to heal before fresh injuries were inflicted. Fire provided another instrument of suffering. Hot irons and heated pokers were applied to sensitive flesh, while some victims had burning coals forced into their mouths. The screams echoing through the castle became so constant that long-term residents reportedly learned to ignore them as mere background noise. Winter offered its own possibilities for torment. Victims were dragged naked into the snow and doused with water, left to freeze until frostbite claimed their extremities. The brutal Hungarian cold could kill within hours. Witnesses also described needles driven beneath fingernails, pins inserted into flesh, starvation, and force feeding. The sheer variety suggested a dark creativity, an imagination devoted to the craft of causing pain. As deaths mounted, disposal of bodies became increasingly problematic. Early victims received proper Christian burial, with priests officiating and deaths recorded in parish registers. But formalities grew impractical as numbers rose. Bodies were buried secretly in orchards and fields, hidden in cellars, or dumped in remote locations. The servants tasked with these disposals became bound to their mistress through shared guilt. Why did these accomplices participate in such horrors? Fear certainly played a role, since defying the Countess meant death. Some may have harbored their own sadistic impulses. Others were perhaps simply products of an age that taught peasants from birth that nobles held absolute power over their lives and deaths. For years, and perhaps decades, the horrors of Čachtice Castle remained hidden from official scrutiny. The victims were peasants whose lives held no value in the eyes of the law, and their disappearances attracted little notice from authorities who were either complicit, intimidated, or simply indifferent to the affairs of so powerful a noblewoman. The Báthory name cast a long shadow across the region, and few dared challenge one who bore it. Yet rumors have a way of spreading despite all efforts at suppression. Servants whispered to one another despite the mortal risks. Peasant families, who sent daughters to seek employment at the castle and never heard from them again, began asking uncomfortable questions. Local priests noticed the suspicious frequency of deaths recorded among the castle staff. Bodies occasionally surfaced bearing marks of violence that no accident could explain. The Lutheran minister István Magyari became one of the first to voice public concern, weaving hints of dark deeds at Čachtice into his sermons and calling for investigation into the mounting deaths of young women. His accusations remained carefully vague, wrapped in religious condemnation of sin and wickedness, but they helped create an atmosphere of growing suspicion. Far more dangerous to Erzsébet was the interest of György Thurzó, the Hungarian palatine and highest official in the kingdom beneath the king himself. Thurzó possessed both the authority and motivation to pursue the matter. His reasons were partly political, since the Báthory family aligned with rival factions, but genuine horror at the accumulating testimony also drove him forward. He began, quietly gathering evidence, interviewing escaped servants, collecting accounts from local officials, and documenting years of disappearances. The situation demanded delicacy, since Erzsébet remained connected by blood and marriage to Hungary's most powerful families. Complicating matters further were the substantial debts the Habsburg crown owed to the Nádasdy estate, raising questions about whether greed rather than justice motivated the investigation. Nevertheless, by 1610, the evidence had grown impossible to ignore. Thurzó secured authorization from King Matthias II, and on December 29th, led armed men toward Čachtice Castle. The night of December 29th, 1610, brought the bitter cold that characterized Hungarian winters, the kind that turned breath to frost and made every movement a struggle against the elements. György Thurzó led his men toward Čachtice Castle as darkness descended, their torches throwing dancing shadows across ancient stone walls. They came without warning, hoping to catch the Countess unprepared and to preserve evidence that might otherwise be destroyed. What they discovered surpassed their darkest expectations. Within the castle itself lay the body of a young woman, recently dead, and bearing unmistakable signs of savage violence. Other victims were found still alive, but barely clinging to existence, their bodies covered with wounds and burns, too weak to flee even as rescuers arrived. The dungeons and cellars yielded instruments of torture and grim evidence of many more deaths. Erzsébet was taken into custody in her private chambers, displaying remarkable composure despite the intrusion. She proclaimed her innocence and demanded to know by what authority she was being detained. As a noblewoman of exalted rank, she remained protected by Hungarian law from both torture and public trial, privileges that would shield her regardless of what crimes she may have committed. Her servants enjoyed no such protections. Ficsko, Ilona Jo, Dorka, and Katalin Benicka were arrested alongside their mistress and subjected to brutal interrogation. Under torture, they confessed to participating in numerous killings, providing detailed accounts of methods employed and victims claimed. These confessions extracted through pain would form the foundation of the case against the Countess. The number of victims cited varied enormously. Some testimony mentioned dozens, while other accounts claimed hundreds. One servant reported having seen a list in Erzsébet's own hand containing over 600 names. This figure has echoed through centuries of retellings, becoming the standard measure of her alleged crimes. Yet its reliability remains deeply questionable. Confessions obtained through torture are notoriously unreliable, and the accused servants had every reason to magnify their mistress's guilt while minimizing their own complicity in the horrors of Čachtice. The legal proceedings that followed Erzsébet's arrest were shaped by the rigid class distinctions of Hungarian society. A noblewoman of her exalted rank could not be executed or even subjected to public trial without consent of the Diet, Hungary's parliament. King Matthias pressed for full prosecution and execution, but György Thurzó and fellow nobles resisted fiercely. A public trial would expose the dark secrets lurking within aristocratic households, establish dangerous precedents that might threaten their own privileges, and risk destabilizing the entire kingdom. The matter, they insisted, must be handled quietly. The Countess's servants possessed no such protections. In January 1611, Ficsko, Ilona Jo, and Dorka stood trial before a court at Bitcha in proceedings that were swift and whose outcome was never in doubt. All three were convicted of multiple murders and condemned to death. Ilona Ho and Dorka, judged the more culpable participants, received sentences of hideous cruelty. Their fingers were to be torn from their hands with red-hot pincers before they were burned alive. Ficsko, whose involvement was deemed less severe, received the comparative mercy of beheading before his corpse was given to the flames. Katalin Benicka alone escaped execution. The youngest of the accused, she was judged to have participated under coercion and to have never killed with her own hands. Her sentence of life imprisonment may have seemed merciful, though the brutal conditions of 17th-century Hungarian dungeons made survival unlikely and death perhaps preferable. The executions were conducted publicly before gathered crowds who witnessed a spectacle of carefully measured suffering. The screams of the condemned rang across the town square as justice was administered in the manner the age understood it. Visible, visceral, and designed to inspire terror in anyone who might contemplate similar crimes. This was punishment as theater, meant to demonstrate that even those who served the mighty could not escape the consequences of monstrous acts. While her servants suffered the full horrors of 17th-century justice, Erzsébet Báthory herself escaped both formal trial and execution. This was no act of mercy, but rather cold political calculation. György Thurzó, the very man who had orchestrated her arrest, now worked to shield her from the ultimate penalty. His motivations were layered and complex. A public trial would expose how thoroughly the nobility had failed to police its own ranks, raising uncomfortable questions about years of complicity and willful blindness. It would endanger the interests of powerful families connected to the Báthorys through intricate webs of blood and marriage. Property considerations also weighed heavily in the balance. Formal conviction and execution would mean forfeiture of the vast Nádasdy and Báthory estates to the Habsburg crown, stripping Erzsébet's children of their inheritance while enriching royal coffers at the expense of Hungarian noble families. By avoiding trial, Thurzó ensured this wealth would pass to her heirs, preserving the power and influence of the aristocracy he represented. The solution devised was imprisonment without conviction. Erzsébet would be confined within Čachtice Castle itself, her home transformed into her prison. But this was no comfortable house arrest. Workers bricked up the windows and doors of her chambers, leaving only narrow slits for ventilation and the passage of food. The Countess, who had commanded thousands of serfs and controlled one of Hungary's greatest fortunes, found herself reduced to a few dark rooms, walled off from the world she had dominated. The conditions were deliberately severe. Food and water passed through small openings, sufficient to sustain life and nothing more. Visitors were forbidden. Correspondence was prohibited. Her children, despite their pleas, were denied any contact with their mother. Servants who once trembled at her approach now walked past her sealed chambers without acknowledgement. For nearly 4 years, Erzsébet existed in this twilight state. What thoughts occupied her mind during those endless days and nights of solitary darkness, we cannot know. The few surviving records offer nothing beyond confirmation that the prisoner remained alive and that food continued to be delivered. The woman who had inspired such horror and fascination was simply forgotten, left to endure the darkness she had allegedly inflicted upon so many others. Before concluding the narrative of Erzsébet Báthory's fate, we must pause to consider the deeply problematic nature of the evidence upon which her legend rests. For any conscientious historian, the case of the Blood Countess presents profound challenges. The sources are flawed, the motivations of accusers questionable, and the passage of 4 centuries has rendered verification of even basic facts nearly impossible. The primary evidence consists of testimony gathered by Thurzó's investigators and confessions extracted from her servants. These documents preserved in Hungarian archives provide detailed accounts naming victims and describing methods of torture and murder. At first examination, they appear overwhelming, an accumulation of horror that seems to permit no doubt. Yet closer scrutiny reveals troubling problems. The servant confessions were obtained through torture, a method notorious for producing whatever answers interrogators seek. The witnesses had powerful incentives to blame their mistress for crimes in which they themselves participated, hoping to minimize their own guilt by magnifying hers. The investigators were not neutral seekers of truth, but political actors pursuing their own agendas. Thurzó maintained complex relationships with both the Báthory family and the Habsburg crown. His decision to shield Erzsébet from trial while sending her servants to horrible deaths suggests calculations extending far beyond simple justice. The king's eagerness to confiscate her estates added another layer of political motivation. In such an environment, the boundary between investigation and persecution grows impossible to discern. The absence of formal trial meant no defense was ever mounted, no cross-examination ever conducted, no opportunity given for the accused to confront her accusers. By any modern legal standard, her guilt was never established. She was imprisoned solely on allegations never tested in open court. This does not prove innocence. The volume of testimony, the multiple witnesses, and the physical evidence reportedly found at Čachtice all suggest something terrible occurred. But what exactly happened, and the true extent of Erzsébet's personal responsibility remain genuinely uncertain. She may have been one of history's most prolific killers, or the victim of political conspiracy, a powerful woman destroyed by enemies exploiting accusations to seize her wealth. The truth likely lies somewhere between these extremes. What serious historians generally agree upon is that the most sensational elements, particularly the blood-bathing, are almost certainly fictional inventions added decades or centuries later to make an already lurid tale more compelling. While Erzsébet endured her walled imprisonment, the world beyond Čachtice continued its turbulent course. The Kingdom of Hungary, in the early 17th century, existed as a land caught between empires, its territory divided among Habsburg Austria, the Ottoman Turks, and the semi-independent Principality of Transylvania. Religious conflicts between Catholics, Lutherans, and Calvinists added yet another volatile dimension to an already fractured realm. The long Turkish War, in which Ferenc Nadasti had earned his fearsome reputation, had concluded in 1606 with the Peace of Zitvatorok, yet fundamental tensions remained unresolved. Ottoman power, though past its zenith, remained formidable. The Habsburgs, perpetually distracted by conflicts across their sprawling domains, could never commit sufficient resources to properly defend their Hungarian territories. The Hungarian nobility, meanwhile, guarded its privileges jealously, while resisting any measures that might strengthen royal authority at their expense. Within this volatile context, the case of Erzsébet Báthory assumed meanings extending far beyond mere criminal proceedings. It became a symbol of aristocratic excess, a stark warning about the dangers inherent in a system granting nobles virtually unlimited power over their peasants. Lutheran preachers like István Magyari had long thundered against the moral failures of the aristocracy, and the Blood Countess seemed to confirm their darkest prophecies. Here stood proof that Hungary's great lords and ladies had strayed catastrophically from Christian virtue, their wealth and privilege corrupting them beyond redemption. For the peasantry, the case may have provided grim satisfaction. These were people who lived entire lives beneath the absolute authority of nobles, subject to punishments and demands that could prove brutal indeed. To witness one of their oppressors brought low and imprisoned within her own castle walls must have seemed a rare moment of justice in an unjust world. The Báthory family, meanwhile, worked urgently to distance itself from its notorious member. Erzsébet's children quietly assumed control of family estates, maintaining their positions in Hungarian society, while carefully avoiding any association with their mother's alleged crimes. Her name became something never to be spoken, a shameful secret buried as deeply as the bodies reportedly hidden in the grounds around Čachtice. On August 21, 1614, a guard delivering food to the imprisoned countess noticed that the previous day's meal remained untouched. Peering through the narrow slit in the walled-up chamber, he observed Erzsébet lying motionless upon her bed. Further investigation confirmed what the uneaten food had already suggested. The Blood Countess was dead. She was 54 years old and had spent the final 3 years and 8 months of her existence in complete solitary confinement. No cause of death was recorded, though it was presumably natural, the result of age or illness, or simply the accumulated toll of harsh imprisonment in darkness. There was no autopsy, no formal inquest. The authorities who had labored so diligently to capture and confine her displayed little interest in the precise circumstances of her demise. The burial proceeded quietly without ceremony or public announcement. Erzsébet had expressed a wish to be interred in the church at Čachtice, but the local population objected with such vehemence that this plan was abandoned. Instead, her body was transported to the Báthory family crypt at Erzsébet in northeastern Hungary, where she was laid to rest among her ancestors. The exact location of her grave was never marked, and over the centuries, all trace of it has been lost. The Blood Countess, who had loomed so large in life, vanished into complete anonymity in death. The immediate reaction to her passing proved remarkably subdued. There were no celebrations, no formal acknowledgments from the authorities who had pursued her. The matter had been handled quietly and would remain so. The Nádasdy and Báthory families continued their roles in Hungarian society, their reputations damaged but not destroyed. The peasants who had suffered under Erzsébet's rule returned to their daily struggles, their former mistress's death changing nothing fundamental about their circumstances. Yet if the immediate aftermath was muted, the longer-term impact would prove profound. The story of Erzsébet Báthory, suppressed during her lifetime and the years immediately following her death, would eventually emerge into the light. And once it emerged, it would never cease growing. For decades following Erzsébet's death, her story remained virtually unknown beyond Hungary's borders. The trial records gathered dust in archives, witnesses passed away, and Čachtice Castle gradually crumbled into ruin. A new generation arose with no knowledge of the Blood Countess, their attention consumed by the 17th century's endless crises, including the 30 Years' War, continued Ottoman threats, and perpetual struggles between Habsburgs and Hungarian nobles. The first published account appeared in 1729, more than a century after her death. Laszlo Turoczi, a Jesuit scholar, included a brief description of her crimes in his History of Hungary. His account drew upon the trial records and presented the case in straightforward terms as an example of noble depravity meeting divine justice. Yet even in this early telling, the story had begun acquiring embellishments that would multiply with each retelling. The legend truly crystallized during the late 18th and early 19th centuries. The Romantic movement, with its fascination for the Gothic, the macabre, and the aristocratic, found in Erzsébet Báthory an irresistible subject. Writers elaborated upon the basic narrative, adding details with no foundation in historical record but perfectly suited to the sensibilities of their age. The blood-bathing appears to have originated during this period. The notion that Erzsébet murdered young women specifically to bathe in their blood, believing it would preserve her youth and beauty, proved too perfect a Gothic image to resist. It transformed her from mere sadist into something mythical, a vampire in all but name who sustained herself on innocent lives. This detail, wholly fictional as far as historians can determine, became the defining element of her legend. Conflation with vampirism was perhaps inevitable. She was a Hungarian noblewoman who allegedly killed in great numbers with possible connections to blood. Her crimes occurred in regions bordering Transylvania, already associated in Western imagination with the supernatural. When Bram Stoker published Dracula in 1897, he drew upon Eastern European folklore, and while no direct evidence links him to knowledge of Erzsébet specifically, she certainly formed part of the cultural atmosphere that produced his famous novel. By the 20th century, the Blood Countess had become firmly established in horror literature and film, reimagined by each generation according to its own particular fears and fascinations. The castle that served as both Erzsébet Báthory's domain and her final prison still stands upon a rocky hill in western Slovakia, though standing may be too generous a term for what remains. The structure that once terrified peasants across the countryside and witnessed such alleged horrors now exists as a picturesque ruin, its walls crumbling and its chambers open to the sky. It has become a destination for visitors from around the world who come to walk where the Blood Countess once walked, and to imagine what scenes may have unfolded within these stones. The castle's history extends far beyond its infamous residents. Originally constructed in the 13th century, it served as a defensive fortification against various invaders across the centuries. The Nádasdy family acquired it during the 16th century, transforming it into one of their most important residences. Following Erzsébet's death, the castle continued to be inhabited, though her dark association cast a permanent shadow that never fully lifted. A devastating fire in the 18th century caused significant damage, and the fortress was subsequently abandoned. Without maintenance, the structures gradually deteriorated as stones fell from walls and roofs collapsed beneath the weight of countless winters. By the 19th century, Čachtice had become a romantic ruin, its grim history only adding to its appeal for an age fascinated by Gothic atmosphere. Today, the ruins have been partially stabilized and opened to visitors. A small museum in the village below displays artifacts related to the castle's history, including reproductions of documents from the Báthory case. The climb remains steep but rewarding, offering panoramic views that explain why this location was originally chosen for fortification. Standing among the broken walls, one can easily imagine the castle during its prime, with servants bustling about and noble visitors arriving. It is equally easy, perhaps too easy, to imagine darker scenes. The tourism industry has enthusiastically exploited the Blood Countess legend, with guides pointing out cellars where victims may have been confined and chambers where crimes allegedly occurred. Local legends have multiplied over centuries, with villagers once refusing to approach after dark, believing the ruins haunted by ghosts of the countless victims. Such stories continue circulating as part of the rich folklore surrounding any place associated with tragedy and evil. Modern observers approaching Erzsébet Báthory's case with psychological rather than theological frameworks have inevitably asked what mental condition might explain her alleged behavior. If she truly committed the crimes attributed to her, what pathology transformed an intelligent and capable noblewoman into a mass murderer? The challenge of retrospective psychological diagnosis proves formidable. We cannot interview her, administer tests, or observe her behavior directly. We possess only the biased and incomplete accounts of her accusers, filtered through centuries of legend-making. Any diagnosis remains necessarily speculative, more an exercise in imagination than genuine science. Nevertheless, various possibilities have been proposed. Some writers suggest Erzsébet suffered from epilepsy, a condition interpreted in her era as demonic possession, and sometimes associated with personality changes and violent behavior. Her family's alleged history of mental instability has been cited as evidence of hereditary conditions. The widespread practice of intermarriage among Hungarian nobility, concentrating genetic material across generations, may have elevated risks of various disorders. Others focus on what modern clinicians would classify as personality disorders. The pleasure Erzsébet allegedly derived from inflicting pain suggests sadistic traits extending beyond ordinary cruelty into genuine pathology. Her apparent ability to function normally in other domains, competently managing estates and raising children while allegedly torturing servants, remains consistent with the compartmentalization observed in psychopathic individuals. Some scholars argue that whatever Erzsébet may have done differed from other nobles of her era only in degree rather than kind. The culture of violence that shaped her childhood, the absolute power she wielded over servants, and the complete absence of external restraint may have gradually escalated typical aristocratic discipline into something monstrous. By this interpretation, she represents less a unique aberration than an extreme manifestation of a system that enabled and encouraged cruelty. Questions of sexuality have also arisen. Some accounts suggest romantic or sexual relationships with women, and certain alleged tortures carried sexual dimensions. Whether this reflects historical reality or later projection remains unclear. The association of female violence with deviant sexuality follows a long tradition, and the Blood Countess legend may partly derive from anxieties about women who violate expected gender norms. None of these explanations proves entirely satisfactory, and all must be held tentatively given the evidence's severe limitations. What we can state confidently is that if Erzsébet Báthory committed even a fraction of the acts attributed to her, such behavior was extraordinary by any standard across any era. No account of the Blood Countess would be complete without examining those who allegedly helped commit her crimes. The 4 servants arrested alongside Erzsébet played crucial roles in both the alleged atrocities and the subsequent legal proceedings. Their testimony provided the evidence that condemned their mistress, while their own fates demonstrated the brutal justice of the age. János Újvári, called Ficsko, remains the most enigmatic figure among them. A dwarf, he occupied an unusual position within the household hierarchy. Such individuals were often employed by noble families as entertainers or curiosities, yet Ficsko rose to genuine authority as Erzsébet's major domo, managing daily operations while allegedly participating directly in torture and murder. Testimony portrayed him as an active and willing participant who took initiative rather than merely following orders. He was accused of personally killing dozens of victims through methods ranging from simple beatings to elaborate torments. At trial, he reportedly claimed to have lost count of his victims, though whether this confession was genuine or extracted through torture remains impossible to determine. Ilona Ho was an elderly woman who had served as Erzsébet's childhood nurse and remained in her household throughout life. Her long association provided unique perspective on the alleged crimes, and her testimony proved among the most detailed, describing specific incidents spanning years while naming victims and explaining methods of recruitment and disposal. The relationship between nurse and mistress must have been profoundly complex. Having known Erzsébet from infancy, Ilona witnessed her transformation from child to bride to widow to alleged monster. Whether she participated from loyalty, fear, or darker impulses, the records do not reveal. Found guilty of participating in over 30 murders, she was executed alongside Dorka, with fingers torn off before being burned alive. Dorothea Sentes, known as Dorka, had entered service as a washerwoman later in life. Her role appears primarily practical, helping procure victims, assisting during torture, and disposing of bodies. Accused of taking evident pleasure in victims' suffering, she received the same horrific execution as Ilona. Catalin Benica, the youngest servant, received the most lenient treatment. The court determined she had been coerced and had not killed directly, sentencing her to life imprisonment. These fates raise troubling questions about justice and culpability that remain unanswerable across the centuries. In the vast literature surrounding Erzsébet Báthory, surprisingly little attention has focused on the victims themselves. They appear throughout accounts merely as numbers, as anonymous peasant girls whose only significance lies in their suffering and death. Their names, when recorded at all, are listed without detail or context. Their lives before entering service at Čachtice remain almost entirely unknown. This anonymity constitutes its own form of violence, an erasure continuing the dehumanization they allegedly experienced within those castle walls. The victims were people, each possessing a family, a history, hopes for the future. They were daughters and sisters, perhaps mothers themselves. They came to the castle seeking employment and opportunity, a chance to better their circumstances, and found instead a nightmare from which most would never escape. What can be recovered about them? The trial records preserve some names and circumstances. Many were young, in their teens or early 20s. Most came from peasant families, though testimony suggests that later in her career, Erzsébet began targeting daughters of minor noble families as well. This escalation, if it truly occurred, may have been what finally attracted official attention. Crimes against peasants could be overlooked indefinitely, but crimes against nobles demanded response. The geographic distribution of victims indicates a wide recruiting network stretching across the region. Girls traveled considerable distances to Čachtice, lured by promises of wages, comfortable quarters, and opportunities to learn valuable skills. The reality awaiting them proved entirely different. Some women did survive their time in service. Those who escaped or were released before the arrest provided testimony corroborating accounts from the imprisoned servants. They described conditions inside the castle, punishments they witnessed or endured, and their terror of the mistress who held absolute power over their lives. Their survival was largely a matter of luck, having departed before becoming subjects of fatal attention. Families of victims testified when given opportunity. Parents who sent daughters to Čachtice and never saw them again finally received a chance to demand answers. Their grief and anger preserved in legal records provides some of the most emotionally powerful testimony in the case. These were not abstract numbers, but real people mourning real losses. Modern efforts to memorialize victims remain limited. No monument stands at Čachtice commemorating those who died. Tourism focuses almost exclusively on the perpetrator, treating victims as mere props in the Blood Countess drama. This imbalance reflects broader patterns in how society remembers violent crime, elevating perpetrators to fame while forgetting those they harmed. Of all elements comprising the Erzsébet Báthory legend, none has proven more enduring than the claim that she bathed in the blood of her victims to preserve her youth. This image has dominated popular portrayals for centuries, inspiring countless novels, films, and artistic works. Yet it appears nowhere in contemporary sources, and is almost certainly a later invention. The earliest accounts, including trial records and first published descriptions, make no mention of blood bathing. They describe torture and murder in graphic detail, but say nothing about Erzsébet using victims' blood for cosmetic purposes. The accusation appears to have first surfaced during the 18th century, long after anyone who might have witnessed such events had died. Where did this myth originate? Several theories have been proposed. One suggests it developed from accounts of Erzsébet biting her victims or tearing at their flesh, behaviors allegedly witnessed that would have involved blood. Through time and repeated retelling, these incidents may have been elaborated into the more dramatic image of actual bathing. Another theory connects the blood myth to broader cultural anxieties about aristocratic vanity and exploitation of lower classes. The image of a noblewoman literally consuming the lives of peasant girls to preserve her own beauty serves as a powerful metaphor for the parasitic relationship between rulers and ruled. It may have developed not as historical fact, but as moral commentary, expressing the essential evil of a social system that valued aristocratic comfort over common lives. Connection to vampire mythology also proves relevant. By the 18th and 19th centuries, Eastern Europe was firmly associated in Western imagination with vampires and supernatural predators. Erzsébet's alleged crimes, already extreme, were easily assimilated into this framework. Blood bathing transformed her from human criminal into something archetypal, an immortal monster sustained by innocent blood. Whatever its origins, the myth has proven remarkably durable. Despite historians' efforts to correct the record, popular accounts continue presenting blood bathing as established fact. Films and novels routinely depict Erzsébet immersed in crimson pools, surrounded by elaborate rituals. The image remains simply too compelling to abandon, regardless of historical accuracy. This persistence raises interesting questions about relationships between history and legend. At what point does a story become so embedded in cultural consciousness that correction becomes impossible? How do we balance the historian's duty to accuracy against public appetite for compelling narrative? In the case of the Blood Countess, legend has clearly triumphed. The case of Erzsébet Báthory has attracted considerable attention from scholars interested in questions of gender, power, and representation of women throughout history. Some argue that her treatment both during her lifetime and across subsequent centuries reflects deep anxieties about women who transgress expected gender roles. In 16th-century Hungary, noblewomen occupied an ambiguous position. They could inherit property, manage estates, and exercise considerable informal influence. Yet they remained ultimately subject to male authority through fathers, husbands, and the broader patriarchal structures of church and state. A woman who refused these constraints, who exercised power in her own name and for her own purposes, was inherently threatening to the established order. Erzsébet, especially following her husband's death, embodied precisely such a woman. She controlled vast wealth without male supervision. She made decisions about estate management without consulting higher authority. She exercised power of life and death over servants, as noble masters had always done, but without the legitimizing presence of a male head of household. This independence may have rendered her particularly vulnerable to accusations of abusing her power. The sexual dimensions of the case deserve consideration as well. Many alleged tortures carried sexual aspects with victims stripped naked, genitals burned or mutilated, violence occurring in intimate settings like bedchambers. Whether this reflects historical fact or projections of male accusers and later writers remains difficult to determine. The image of Erzsébet as sexual predator has nonetheless persisted as a central element of her legend. Some feminist scholars argue she may have been victim of political conspiracy. her alleged crimes invented or exaggerated by men seeking to destroy a powerful woman. By this reading, she becomes something like a witch trial victim, accused of impossible crimes because she threatened male authority. The absence of formal trial, reliance on tortured confessions, and political motivations of accusers all support this interpretation. Others push back against such readings, arguing they risk minimizing genuine violence against women. If Erzsébet truly tortured and murdered young women, interpreting her as victim of patriarchy seems perverse. Her victims were also women whose suffering should not be overshadowed by sympathy for their alleged killer. The truth probably encompasses complexity. Erzsébet may have been both perpetrator of terrible violence and victim of politically motivated prosecution. These possibilities are not mutually exclusive. Understanding her case requires holding multiple truths simultaneously, recognizing both the reality of her power and the constraints under which she operated. Erzsébet Báthory was not the only noble in history accused of serial violence against those under their authority. Placing her case in comparative context illuminates both its unique features and its connections to broader patterns of aristocratic brutality across Europe. In France, Gilles de Rais, companion of Joan of Arc and one of the wealthiest nobles of his generation, was executed in 1440 for the murder of dozens or perhaps hundreds of children. His case shares certain features with Erzsébet's, including the exploitation of absolute power over the vulnerable, apparent sadistic pleasure in causing suffering, and eventual downfall when crimes became too numerous to ignore. Like the Blood Countess, Gilles has become a figure of legend with his historical reality obscured by centuries of elaboration and myth-making. In Russia, Ivan the Terrible earned his epithet partly through treatment of those he suspected of disloyalty. The massacres at Novgorod in 1570, when thousands died on his orders, demonstrated that royal power could be exercised with virtually no constraints. Other Russian nobles followed their czar's example, treating serfs with casual brutality that sometimes escalated into murder without consequence. Within the Habsburg territories themselves, other cases of noble violence attracted official attention. The difference was usually one of degree rather than kind. Nobles were expected to discipline servants physically, with the only question being whether discipline exceeded acceptable bounds. What constituted acceptable varied by time, place, and the status of victims. Crimes against peasants rarely warranted investigation, while violence against nobles demanded response. What made Erzsébet's case unusual was the combination of several factors rather than any single element. The gender of the perpetrator attracted particular attention in an era when female violence was considered unnatural. The alleged scale of crimes exceeded what authorities could overlook. The specific sexual nature of violence added scandalous dimensions. Most importantly, political circumstances aligned against her at a moment when powerful interests benefited from her. Downfall. Many nobles committed terrible acts against servants without ever facing consequences. Erzsébet was brought down not because her behavior was entirely unique, but because a particular combination of political interests, personal enemies, and financial motivations converged at the wrong moment. Her case reveals less about individual monstrosity than about the systems of power that enabled such violence while selectively prosecuting it according to political convenience. To fully understand Erzsébet Báthory's downfall, one must examine the financial and political dimensions lurking beneath the surface of her prosecution. The Kingdom of Hungary in the early 17th century existed not as an independent state, but as a component of vast Habsburg domains, ruled from Vienna by monarchs whose interests frequently conflicted with those of Hungarian nobility. This tension shaped every aspect of the Báthory case. Ferenc Nadasdy, during his lifetime, had been among Hungary's wealthiest men. His military campaigns against the Ottomans proved expensive, but they earned him the gratitude of the Habsburg crown. That gratitude took tangible form as the crown borrowed heavily from Nadasdy to finance its wars, accumulating debts that by some estimates exceeded the annual revenue of entire provinces. When Ferenc died in 1604, these obligations passed to his widow. Erzsébet thus found herself possessing not only vast estates, but substantial claims against the royal treasury. King Matthias II owed her enormous sums with no realistic prospect of repayment. Habsburg finances were perpetually strained across multiple simultaneous conflicts and an unwieldy imperial bureaucracy. The Nadasdy debts represented a chronic irritation, a constant reminder of obligations that could never be met. From this perspective, the prosecution assumes different coloring. If Erzsébet could be convicted and her estates confiscated, the crown's debts would effectively vanish. Nadasdy properties would pass to royal treasury rather than to her heirs. Embarrassing financial obligations would simply disappear. This is not to suggest charges were entirely fabricated for financial motives. Witness testimony, however flawed, indicates something genuinely terrible occurred at Čachtice. But the timing and vigor of prosecution may well have been influenced by crown financial interests. The decision to investigate, resources devoted to gathering evidence, and political support for bringing charges all become more comprehensible when viewed through this lens. György Thurzó's role was shaped by competing pressures. As Palatine, he bore responsibility for maintaining order and administering justice. But as Hungarian noble, he remained committed to preserving aristocratic privileges against Habsburg encroachment. His decision to imprison Erzsébet without trial represented careful compromise, satisfying demands for action while preventing the crown from seizing her estates. The arrangement ensured Nadasdy and Báthory properties would pass to Erzsébet's children rather than the treasury. King Matthias was reportedly furious, having wanted public trial and execution to demonstrate royal justice and claim confiscated estates. His letters pressed Thurzó for harsher measures, but the Palatine held firm. The Báthory case became one early skirmish in a longer struggle between crown and nobility over Hungarian governance that would eventually erupt in open rebellion. The religious landscape of early 17th century Hungary added another layer of complexity to the Báthory affair. The Protestant Reformation had swept through the region during the previous century, and by 1610, the Hungarian nobility was predominantly Lutheran or Calvinist. The Habsburgs, by contrast, remained staunchly Catholic and would soon launch the Counter-Reformation that would convulse Central Europe for decades to come. The Báthory family had embraced Protestantism, along with much of the Hungarian elite. Erzsébet herself was raised Lutheran and apparently maintained this faith throughout her life. The minister István Magyari, who first raised public concerns about her activities, operated within a Protestant framework of moral critique, calling out sin wherever he found it, regardless of the sinner's social status. The religious dimension manifested in several ways throughout the case. Protestant preachers had long criticized moral failings of the nobility, arguing that wealth and power had corrupted the ruling class beyond redemption. The Blood Countess seemed to confirm their most alarming warnings. Here was proof that Hungary's great families had strayed catastrophically from Christian virtue, that their very souls stood in mortal danger. The case became a cautionary tale preached from pulpits throughout the region. Simultaneously, the Habsburg crown's Catholicism created suspicions about motivations for prosecution. Was the king pursuing Erzsébet because of her crimes, or because she represented the Protestant nobility he sought to undermine? The religious politics of the era made such questions unavoidable, even if they could never be definitively answered. The trial of servants contained religious elements as well. The accused were questioned not only about murders, but about witchcraft, heresy, and dealings with the devil. 17th-century jurisprudence drew no clear distinction between criminal behavior and supernatural evil. Some witnesses claimed Erzsébet had employed magic in her crimes, consulting with witches and using enchantments to torture victims. These accusations were never proven, but added to the atmosphere of diabolical horror surrounding the case. The absence of demonic charges in the final prosecution proves significant. Unlike many contemporary witch trials, the Báthory case ultimately focused on straightforward criminal allegations of torture and murder. This may reflect influence of György Thurso and other nobles seeking to avoid theological complications of a witchcraft prosecution. It may also reflect recognition that sorcery accusations were difficult to prove and might undermine the case's credibility. Nevertheless, the shadow of the supernatural hung over all proceedings. Erzsébet Báthory entered popular imagination as something more than mere murderer, becoming associated with darkness, evil, and forces beyond normal human understanding. This transformation from criminal to demon would accelerate across centuries, eventually producing the vampire-like figure of modern legend. In the centuries since Erzsébet Báthory's death, various attempts have been made to investigate physical evidence of her alleged crimes. The ruins of Čachtice Castle have been explored by archaeologists, historians, and curious amateurs, all seeking traces of horrors that may have occurred within its walls. The results of these investigations have proven inconclusive. The castle has lain in ruins for centuries, with stones scattered and chambers collapsed. Whatever physical evidence may once have existed has been destroyed, removed, or buried beyond recovery. No mass graves have been definitively identified. No torture chambers have been authenticated. The physical proof that might confirm or refute allegations against Erzsébet simply does not exist. This absence of evidence has been interpreted in different ways. Skeptics argue that the lack of physical proof supports theories that charges were fabricated or exaggerated. If hundreds of victims died at Čachtice, where are the bodies? Why have no remains been found despite centuries of intense interest in the case? The silence of the archaeological record, they suggest, speaks volumes about what actually occurred. Others counter that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Bodies buried 4 centuries ago may have decomposed beyond recognition. The castle's destruction scattered its contents across the surrounding landscape. The remote locations of many alleged burial sites in forests and fields far from the castle itself make systematic excavation impractical, if not impossible. Some investigations have claimed to find suggestive evidence. Bones have been discovered in and around the castle, though without modern forensic analysis it remains impossible to determine their age, origin, or manner of death. Cellars and underground chambers have been identified that might have served as dungeons or torture rooms, but none of this rises to the level of proof that would satisfy rigorous historical standards. The village of Čachtice itself preserves memories of the Blood Countess passed down through generations of local families. These oral traditions collected by folklorists and historians provide an alternative source of information about events at the castle. But oral tradition is notoriously unreliable, especially across such vast stretches of time. Stories grow in the telling, details are invented or forgotten, and the boundary between memory and legend becomes impossible to discern. Modern technology offers some hope for future investigation. Ground-penetrating radar, advanced DNA analysis, and other techniques might reveal information that earlier methods could not detect. But such investigations require resources, permissions, and scholarly interest that have not always been forthcoming. For now, the secrets of Čachtice remain hidden beneath centuries of rubble and silence. The transformation of Erzsébet Báthory from historical figure to literary character began almost immediately after accounts of her crimes became widely known. Writers recognized in her story elements perfectly suited to the Gothic imagination, including a remote castle, a beautiful noblewoman, innocent victims, and unspeakable horrors committed in secret chambers. The Blood Countess was simply too compelling to leave to historians alone. The earliest fictional treatments appeared during the late 18th century as the Gothic novel emerged as a distinct literary form. These works drew upon basic outlines of the Báthory story while adding invented elements to heighten horror and drama. Blood-bathing, absent from historical sources, became a standard feature of fictional accounts, too perfect an image to omit regardless of accuracy. The 19th century witnessed an explosion of Báthory-related literature. German, Hungarian, and French writers produced novels, plays, and poems inspired by her story. Some portrayed her as straightforward villain, a monster whose crimes demanded punishment. Others took more sympathetic approaches, exploring the psychology of a woman driven to madness by circumstances. Still others used her as vehicle for social commentary, critiquing aristocratic privilege and exploitation of the poor. The Romantic movement found in Erzsébet a perfect subject. Her combination of beauty, nobility, and evil aligned with romantic fascinations with the sublime and transgressive. She became associated with other legendary female villains, such as Lucrezia Borgia and Lady Macbeth, the seductresses and sorceresses of myth and legend. Her crimes, terrible as they were, took on aesthetic dimensions, transformed from mere brutality into dark art. By the 20th century, the Blood Countess had become a fixture of horror literature, appearing in novels, short stories, and eventually films. She remained always recognizable by certain key elements, including bathing in blood, torture of young women, and the castle in the Carpathians. Historical accuracy became increasingly irrelevant as legendary Erzsébet displaced the historical figure entirely. Notable literary treatments include Valentine Penrose's 1962 work The Bloody Countess, which combined historical research with poetic imagination to create an influential portrait of Erzsébet as lesbian vampire. Penrose's interpretation proved instrumental in establishing the view of Báthory's crimes as sexually motivated, an interpretation dominating subsequent portrayals. Whether this reflects historical reality or Penrose's own preoccupations remains a matter of ongoing debate. More recent authors have attempted to rehabilitate Erzsébet, or at least complicate her image, portraying her as victim of political conspiracy or a woman destroyed by patriarchal society. These revisionist portrayals have had limited impact on popular perceptions, which remain dominated by the traditional image of the monstrous Blood Countess. The film industry discovered Erzsébet Báthory early in its history, recognizing the cinematic potential of her legend. The combination of aristocratic settings, female villainy, and graphic violence made her story ideal for adaptation, and dozens of films featuring the Blood Countess have been produced over the past century. The earliest film treatments were relatively restrained, limited by censorship standards of their era. They focused on psychological aspects of the story, suggesting horrors rather than depicting them explicitly. The Countess was portrayed as mad, evil, or possessed, but the specific nature of her crimes was often left to imagination. The relaxation of censorship during the 1960s and 1970s allowed filmmakers to explore more explicit dimensions of the Báthory legend. European horror films of this era, particularly those from studios like Hammer in Britain and various continental producers, depicted blood-bathing and torture in graphic detail. These films often emphasized erotic dimensions of violence, presenting Erzsébet as a predator whose crimes combined sexual and sadistic elements in ways designed to titillate as much as terrify. Ingrid Pitt's portrayal in the 1971 film Countess Dracula became perhaps the most iconic screen version of the character. Pitt brought a combination of beauty and menace to the role, creating an Erzsébet who remained sympathetic even while committing terrible crimes. The film's emphasis on blood-bathing as means of preserving youth gave the story tragic dimension. The Countess was not merely evil, but desperately afraid of aging, willing to do anything to maintain her fading beauty. Subsequent decades produced numerous additional film versions ranging from art house productions to low-budget exploitation films. Quality varied enormously, but certain elements remained constant, including the castle, beautiful victims, blood, and the Countess herself, forever young and forever hungry. The cinematic Erzsébet became entirely divorced from the historical figure, a mythological character whose relationship to the real Báthory remained purely nominal. Recent films have attempted more nuanced portrayals. Julie Delpy's 2009 film The Countess presented Erzsébet as a woman destroyed by love, driven to madness through rejection and betrayal. The film acknowledged uncertainty surrounding the historical case, suggesting allegations may have been exaggerated or entirely fabricated. This sympathetic treatment found critical favor but achieved limited box office success, suggesting audiences preferred their Blood Countess unambiguously villainous rather than complicated by historical nuance or psychological depth. Contemporary psychological and criminological perspectives offer frameworks for understanding Erzsébet Báthory that were unavailable to her contemporaries. If we accept that she committed at least some crimes attributed to her, what can modern science reveal about her motivations and mental state? The concept of serial murder as a distinct phenomenon emerged only in the 20th century, yet Erzsébet's alleged behavior fits the pattern disturbingly well. Serial killers typically select victims from vulnerable populations, develop ritualized methods of killing, and continue crimes over extended periods until external forces intervene. All these elements appear in the Báthory case. The sadistic nature of alleged crimes suggests what modern clinicians would term sexual sadism disorder, a condition in which individuals derive pleasure from the suffering of others. This pleasure may or may not be explicitly sexual. In some cases, the arousal is more generalized, a sense of power and control producing intense satisfaction. Descriptions of Erzsébet's apparent enjoyment of torture, if accurate, align with this diagnosis. Psychopathy represents another relevant concept. Psychopaths are characterized by lack of empathy, superficial charm, manipulativeness, and grandiose sense of self-worth. They commit terrible acts without remorse because they simply do not experience emotional connections that restrain normal behavior. Erzsébet's alleged ability to function normally in social settings while secretly torturing servants remains consistent with psychopathic compartmentalization. The role of power and privilege in enabling alleged crimes cannot be overlooked. Research on psychology of power suggests that individuals in positions of unchecked authority may gradually lose capacity for empathy, coming to see those beneath them as objects rather than people. This process, sometimes called the power paradox, may help explain how a noblewoman could treat servants with such apparent cruelty. Her power was so absolute, her victims so helpless, that normal moral constraints simply ceased to apply. Developmental factors may also prove relevant. Erzsébet's upbringing amid normalized violence, her exposure to torture and execution at young age, and possible mental instability in her family lineage could all have contributed to formation of a sadistic personality. The interaction between genetic predisposition and environmental influence in developing violent behavior is complex, and we cannot untangle these factors in a historical case where evidence remains so limited. It is important to note that all such analysis is necessarily speculative. We cannot diagnose someone who lived 4 centuries ago based on biased testimony and incomplete records. Psychological frameworks we apply are modern constructs that may not translate meaningfully to early modern contexts. The fundamental question of whether Erzsébet actually committed alleged crimes remains unresolved, making psychological analysis of a potentially innocent person not only futile, but ethically problematic. 4 centuries after Erzsébet Báthory's imprisonment and death, the question of her guilt remains genuinely contested. Serious scholars have reached opposite conclusions based on the same limited evidence, and the debate shows no signs of resolution. The case for guilt rests on the volume and consistency of testimony. Dozens of witnesses provided accounts of crimes at Čachtice, describing specific incidents, naming victims, and corroborating each other's stories. Physical evidence, including bodies and torture implements, was reportedly discovered at the castle. The sheer number of accusations from so many different sources suggests something terrible was occurring. Where there is this much smoke, the argument goes, there must surely be fire. The case against guilt, or at least against the full scope of allegations, is equally substantial. Testimony was extracted under torture, a method known to produce false confessions tailored to interrogators' expectations. Witnesses had powerful incentives to blame their mistress while minimizing their own involvement. Political motivations of prosecutors, including the Crown's financial interests and Thurzó's factional allegiances, raise serious questions about the investigation's integrity. The absence of formal trial in which Erzsébet could have mounted a defense means accusations were never properly tested against scrutiny. Some scholars propose middle positions. Perhaps Erzsébet was guilty of some crimes, but not others. Perhaps she was harsh with servants, even brutally so, without being the monster of legend. Perhaps a few genuine deaths, whether deliberate or accidental, were exaggerated by political enemies into vast conspiracy of murder. These intermediate theories possess the appeal of nuance, but the disadvantage of being nearly impossible to verify with available evidence. The blood-bathing allegation at least can be confidently rejected. This detail appears nowhere in contemporary sources, and was clearly added later for dramatic effect. Whatever Erzsébet may or may not have done, she almost certainly did not bathe in the blood of victims. The iconic image defining her in popular imagination is fiction. But rejecting the most sensational allegation does not mean rejecting all others. Testimony describes many forms of torture and murder that do not involve blood bathing. Beatings, burnings, exposure to cold, starvation, and mutilation stand as alleged crimes on their own, requiring no supernatural elaboration. If even a fraction of these accounts are accurate, Erzsébet Báthory was a serial killer of remarkable scope. The honest historian must ultimately acknowledge uncertainty. Evidence is insufficient to prove guilt beyond reasonable doubt, yet also insufficient to establish innocence. The truth about what happened at Čachtice Castle may never be known. We are left with a mystery that 4 centuries of investigation and speculation have failed to solve. Whatever the truth about Erzsébet Báthory's crimes, her legacy in cultural memory remains undeniable. She has become one of history's most famous criminals, her name synonymous with aristocratic evil and female violence. Her image appears in novels, films, video games, and countless cultural products. She has been claimed by feminists and their critics, by historians and mythmakers, by artists and entertainers alike. The durability of her legend reflects deep cultural fascinations transcending the specifics of her case. The figure of the murderous aristocrat speaks to anxieties about class and power that remain relevant today. The image of the beautiful woman who kills addresses fears about female agency and sexuality. The Gothic castle filled with secrets speaks to our endless appetite for horror and mystery. Erzsébet Báthory has become a vessel into which each generation pours its own preoccupations and anxieties. In Hungary and Slovakia, her legacy proves more complex. She represents a dark chapter in national history, a reminder of the brutal feudal system that once governed these lands. Some have attempted to rehabilitate her reputation, arguing she was victim of political persecution rather than genuine criminal. Others have embraced the dark tourism potential of her story, developing Čachtice as a destination for visitors seeking Gothic thrills. The victims, meanwhile, remain largely forgotten, their names appearing only as items in lists, their individuality subsumed by collective role as the Blood Countess's prey. For those wishing to walk where she walked, the ruins of Čachtice Castle remain accessible in western Slovakia. The approach requires a moderately difficult hike through forested slopes to the rocky outcrop where the fortress stands. The path winds through terrain little changed since Erzsébet's time. In autumn, when leaves turn and mist gathers in valleys, the atmosphere becomes genuinely eerie. The ruins are extensive but fragmentary, main walls standing to impressive heights, while interiors have largely collapsed. The village below has embraced its dark heritage with a small museum and tourist offerings themed around the Blood Countess. As we conclude this examination, we must ask what her story ultimately means. At one level, she represents the dark side of power, reminding us that authority without accountability corrupts absolutely. At another level, she embodies anxieties about women who transgress expected roles. The uncertainty surrounding her case adds to her appeal, since we love mysteries we cannot solve. And then there is the blood. That image of the Countess bathing in the blood of virgins, however, historically dubious, touches something deep in human psychology connecting to ancient myths and modern anxieties about mortality. Whatever the historical Erzsébet may have been, the legendary Blood Countess has become something larger than any individual life. She is symbol, metaphor, vessel for collective fears and fascinations. She stands at the boundary between history and myth, between fact and fiction. She is the noblewoman who may have murdered hundreds, or the victim of conspiracy who murdered no one. She is the vampire who never existed, yet refuses to die. The walls of Čachtice keep their secrets. The Carpathian winds whisper through the ruins. And somewhere in the depths of our collective imagination, the Blood Countess waits, eternally young, eternally hungry, eternally ours.